I'm going to go and test it out here.
I can't restrain myself now. I want to do it.
I did have some handouts. Yeah, no, that's okay. Right, I'm going to test it out here on YouTube. See what I can find.
Careful.
We are live.
So where do you monitor then the comments that people might have?
It's down here.
So are you going to do that?
No, definitely not. I don't know what to do about that.
Okay, so should I sit there then and monitor?
By all means.
Michael, we just had that refresher training face to face, and one of the face to face guys moved his seat and knocked over a glass of orange juice right into the guy's keyboard and his laptop. Like literally as soon as he put it down, I was just trying to hold. I just thought it was so funny.
Maybe not Greece. I was actually there for 15 months.
Only 6 months.
But still a long 15 months. It's intense. I know somebody was just texting me, it's my leaving party tomorrow. She's like, I'm flying to Germany. And it's like, why aren't you here? I'm like, oh. Wish I were, kind of.
So when they come through this way, there's signs, but they don't have to get to this level now.
Oh yeah.
I've been to just Germany and France.
Yeah.
Oh, I did.
Austria.
Yeah.
3 watches.
3 watches. Do you want to? What am I doing with this? So that's just organised. It made a buzz. Mike. That's the top one. So hold on, wait. So that goes back, and it's top to me forward. Yeah. No, just that. That was just to wave it up again. Ah, okay. Right, got it. Oh my goodness me. That's the middle one.
The middle one's forward.
No, the middle one is forward. Don't worry about the top. The top one is switching on and doing the kind of yeah. Right. So it's that one and that. Yeah. Do you want to just try the middle one?
Yeah.
And then back.
I'm just going to see if I can talk to the people online. Is there anybody online?
Yeah, so. I haven't seen any comments, but it's a yellow flag, yeah.
So I'm just going to put a note in and say, hello.
Right, no, of course.
Okay, so I just put a note saying, welcome and... Well, how do you see if there's somebody online?
You sitting here in the top side? What's car watching? One of them's me.
Yeah. One of them's us. So I'll hang out around here.
Yeah, I'll sit here as well with you just in case maybe as well.
I'm just trying to get people to sort of come
We got that for now. And my other beverages and snacks.
I think it's good actually, yes.
So it's internet. Yeah.
I like to put 4 or 5 hours.
Yeah. Yeah.
Germany apparently spent 2 days on
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
Doing well.
Nice to see you. Yeah, good to see you.
Everything okay?
Yeah. You're not.
Yeah.
Oh, stop.
No,
Basically, I was like, okay. Well, when I get stuck, I'm going to send you.
sorry?
When I get stuck, I'm going to send you.
Yeah, okay, I'll be your buffer. Your piñata if you want somebody. Good, I'm very excited. Hey. How have you been after this? It hasn't been since they stopped there.
Sorry.
Since we stopped all these meetings, I haven't seen you. It's been a very long time.
Yes, it has been a while.
What have you been up to?
So probably most relevant for you is the work with student family life. So that's like really
This is the ongoing, the big, especially the kids, right?
so yeah, that's like focus. So the main thing is, do you know about the private members bill?
Sorry?
The private members bill. So you know what private members bill are?
I know in general, but I don't know the.
Yeah. So basically, the secure one, quite high up in level. The one that we use to get the meeting. There's just like it is reality it won't, but anyway. It's a massively helpful thing. So that the second meeting of that is in late March. So that's our big focus. And there's like 5 organisations working with closely. So that's and it's been great. It's been great focusing mind, focusing on like a very specific aspect. So I'm hoping the campaign will have legs beyond the process.
What kind of campaign? Is it public awareness campaign?
Well, it's very specific around climate change. So there's 3 aspects of Men's Bill. So it's obviously cost enough to talk about value. We don't talk about safety. So there's 3 items. One is for legal aid for families. So for it to reintroduce family cases. The one is around the second round is around, how refugees, children who are found refugees and here on their own don't enjoy family life, even though they're refugees. So it's about introducing families to life.
assisting refugees.
So yeah, any part of Iraq, to get family meal, it's a great chance.
So yeah.
It's the whole yes. And then the last one's about expanding definitely, isn't it? So,
Yeah, to extend family.
yeah. But what's your focus?
We did a lot of Libya and detention in the UK. So we did an assessment of this basically what we wanted to see is to see where we can fill in the gaps in detention and see since we started seeing some issues around detention because of our project that's happening now. We did an assessment and we found something like gaps in the and the reach of the time of the it's very it's because it definitely takes you here in the UK. It's the only country in Europe that has detention, and there's in the only country in Europe. And there's one way only to get out of this one. We make many times it's called Rule 55, and that goes to the Home Office assessment and definitely teaches for the person with detention for that person doesn't work if the clear rates and that's created as issues. So the release of this benefit, the immediate release will be for the benefits and all of this is almost rejected by the Home Office. It's very basic and this evaluation has been applied. But we wanted to find somebody special provide some kind of training, maybe use it act as an external body that will audit
So, I've responded to a request.
Assessment and identify some things, and now we're trying to maneuver.
I get beat. She's a member of our group.
So, I was moving the camera up and down and it was a second delay.
What time do you want to start? I was just thinking maybe we can start at 5 to 10 minutes. Good time.
Got 10 viewers.
But I'll leave you to chat. 10?
10 viewers.
Excuse me, Claire, where's my content? Sorry, 10 viewers.
We need to
9. We lost. Yeah, no.
Yeah.
So, we'll just give people maybe another kind of 5 minutes.
Okay, sure.
And we'll tag.
Yeah.
We'll get started. We've got 9 watching on live stream.
Okay.
At the moment. There seems to be a time lag, however.
yeah, it's like 10 seconds away or something.
Because I'm over here. It's a bit disturbing to see yourself standing over
That's
there.
what I was having such a problem with the webcam. I was moving up and down, I didn't know it was just going.
Of course, now they can't see Anna.
Just going to move in.
Can you meet me?
You're just outside of
You need
the
to
frame.
move
But if you
that
move,
way.
if you move like
I move about quite a lot. I have to say when I talk, you'll have to tell me. I went through a phase where I was doing quite a lot of media work and I kept getting told off for moving about too much.
can you move just one more foot this way? Perfect.
Yeah?
Perfect. Yeah, it's like a 10-second translate. So we're going to start in about 5 minutes. Sorry, we're going to start in about 5 minutes. So if everybody just wants to take whatever snacks and drinks or whatever, and then You're welcome to move to the front of the room as well if you want, so it doesn't. None of us at this end are contagious. Feel free to move forward.
Yeah.
We had the same thing. We did a talk earlier today, and it's amazing how people will. The whole tables, all the tables were full, and people were sitting.
People do, isn't it? Actually, I was going to ask you, she doesn't know. You don't work with me. Oh, excuse me. No,
B, if you can hear me, can you just type I can hear you?
there's one chair.
Can I put this next to you?
Can they actually hear us? Okay.
I think someone's following something. Yeah.
She says she can, but it's distant and muffled. Hopefully, there's a lot of people moving around and a lot of talking, so hopefully that
And I have
will,
quite a loud voice.
The microphone's here as well.
Sorry?
Microphone's here.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Okay. Where did Rob go? Okay, I think maybe we can get started. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm sure we'll have a few people trickle in. It's nice to see so many faces here. I'm Clea, I work with the Take Action MSF Association group. I'm not going to talk for very long because the whole purpose of this is to have Anna talk to us a bit about the asylum system and humanitarian protection and how the system works in the UK. So the objective, the MSF Association group working with migrants and refugees, our aim is to try to get more action, more activism, and to make things hopefully better for refugees and migrants in the UK. And so one of the things that we have realised is useful to people is to have a bit more information about how the system works here, what's working, what's not working, and hopefully the more information is a powerful tool. So hopefully the more information we have, the more of a difference we can make. So this is the first. We're going to have a series of these over the course of 2018. So if you have feedback, should have done feedback form. I couldn't think of that next time. But if you have feedback, please do let us know if if there are particular topics we should talk about in the future, and particular things that you think we should do. And otherwise, I will hand over to Anna. Thank you very much for coming, Anna.
Thanks for having me.
I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
So yeah, I'm Anna Musgrave from the Refugee Council. I did want to take just 10 minutes to find out who you are and who's in the room. There are a few more people than I was expecting, so we might have to do this kind of really quickly. But I was hoping people could give me 4 pieces of information: their name, your name, your connection with MSF, because I'm kind of fascinated by this network, and then if there's something very concrete that you want to get out of this session, it would be good to know that. Given there's a lot of you, don't feel you need to come up with something if it's just general information, but if there's something really concrete you'd like to know about, then now would be the time to tell me. And lastly, something interesting about yourself that no one else in the room knows about. So some of your skeletons in your closet. Do you want to start, Pam?
Oh my God. So I'm Pam O'Brien. I work in the office at MSF. I work in public engagement, which is part of the communications department. So it's mainly organising events, raising awareness about MSF. I would just like to learn about immigration and asylum in general, get an overview. And I can't, because I'm the first, I can't think of anything yet. You can come back to me.
Hi, my name is Madeline. My connection with MSF, I've just been on mission in Bangladesh, so I've just come back from the field. And yeah, no, I just wanted to also just general information and to find out more about the asylum system in the UK. Interesting fact, I have acquired acrocardia in North America, which is one of the 7 topics.
Amazing. Great fact.
Hi, I'm Andrew. My connection with MSF is I'm married to Madeline. I used to work with ICRC for a number of years, and know MSF quite well. In terms of what I'd like to get at, I suppose I've met a lot of families of refugees in Afghanistan and elsewhere. I was helping them to put them in contact with their families in places like the UK, but never really had any insight into the situation is for refugees once they arrive and once they're in place. So I'd like to just know a little bit about how the system is functioning or not. And I don't really have any interesting facts that no one else in the room knows.
Very hard to believe.
Hello, my name is Tracy Lavelle. I work for the NHS, currently for Imperial, which is based over in the west of London. I don't know if anybody in this room knows, but I have worked for NHS in the past with some secret records. Nobody else knows I'm going to play the table this weekend. Can't think of anything else, I'm sorry. And I'm just interested in information that you have to share. It's useful when I go back to work to support refugees and also to support staff have a better understanding rather than being so negative sometimes. Sorry, I said my name is Stella von Winslow.
Connection to MSF.
I work as part of the education team with Pam. And I do school resources. I'm interested in migration practice.
And one interesting fact that no one knows. Pam is willing to step in for you.
Oh no, I thought one for myself.
Yeah, that's
I
what I
used
mean.
to be the only girl on a wrestling team in high school.
Oh wow, that's really, that is really
That's really cool.
I once got thrown out of the Savoy Hotel.
Oh, good fact. I'm not going to tell you why. Worth waiting for. What's that? A bit there. Yeah.
I've done a few missions with MSF as a midwife, but I also worked here as a midwife in the NHS, so I'm particularly interested in general care.
Okay.
Nothing fun about myself.
Okay. Fair enough.
I recently entered the health nurses I recruit just based on general interest and just in fact I'm at UCL studying global health.
Oh, me too.
Okay.
I'm Matt. I work in the UK office in fundraising. I head up the face-to-face team. I'm here just because I want to get a better understanding of seeking asylum in the UK. So I deal with a lot of members of the public all the time and their opinions. So it'd be nice to have some extra ammunition for me, I think. Interesting fact about me: when I was a door-to-door fundraiser, I signed up Lee Evans and Danny Dyer and Alex Ferguson.
Yes, very impressive. Yes.
Andrew, my connection with MSF, I was in the field for many years and now I'm an association member. Interested in learning more about the asylum process. And my wife is in the room, so she knows everything from me.
Okay.
My name is Fran Miller. I worked for MSF for quite a long time operationally, but I'm also a PSCU consultant. In the UK, I work for South London North, the NHS Trust, and I'm the trauma pathway lead for London. I have worked for non-governmental organisations in London in the past and had a lot to do with undocumented migrants.
And your interesting fact?
Sorry?
Your interesting fact?
I'll go for a drink after this.
Fine, I've already started. My name is Colin Herman. I have worked in the field for MSF. Now I'm on the MSF UK board. My background is legal. I've practiced as a solicitor for many years.
though it's quite some time since I studied refugee law, so I'm here to hopefully get an update on how things are working. That's really cool. My interesting thing is that Fran is going to find me drink.
No, that was surprising.
Nobody in the room knew that, including Fran.
My name is Phil. I'm a nurse. Just come back from the field recently with MSF. I do a bit of volunteering with the Doctors of Health Clinic, so I work a lot with refugees and asylum seekers there. So again, to get back to that, so I'd like to learn a bit more. And I like to make origami face masks.
Wow.
I'm Jane. I'm currently on a freelance basis for MSF, but I've been with them for a very long time. I'm not sure. I'm just here for general interest more than anything else. I used to work on the refugee project that we had in the MSF UK office at one particular time. It was a research project, not a project. And that most people probably don't know that that's what we had in the UK office at one point. Going back to 2004, which is quite a long time ago.
Costa?
Hi, my name is Costa. I work for the program unit here in the office. I'm the policy and advocacy advisor, and I work on migration. I've been working the last 8 years in MSF, and I'm here because I work on migration and I'm very interested in the whole issue.
And your interesting fact?
Nothing that is appropriate for everyone.
I'm Rachel Bingham. I'm a doctor at Freedom from Torture, so I'm very interested in this. I'm a medical legal consultant. I was with MSF last year in Egypt for 6 months and worked on migration. I know a really good recipe for Christmas pudding that doesn't require soaking the fruit.
Thank you. Okay. Ambition for 2018.
I'm Rob Brecker. I worked in the field of MSF a couple of times as a doctor, and since coming back, I am now public health doctor working at Croydon. I also jointly chair the TAG Action Group from Clear, and particularly been working around access to healthcare and pricing to healthcare and collaborating with doctors of the world on a project around that. And an interesting fact about me, when I was younger, I would sometimes play my dad's Eagles tribute band and dress up as George Harrison, but all week on.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Well, I'm Mike. I work for MSF here in London. I'm on the IT department. The reason I'm here is just because obviously I like to hear...
Do the techie stuff.
Well, as well as obviously understanding what's going on with all the refugees and things like that. And an interesting fact is obviously, as you can tell, I'm from the North East.
Yeah, my name is Van. I'm part of TAG Action Group.
We'll leave it clear.
Busted.
Nice try.
I'm Clea. I've been with MSF for quite a while now in a variety of different roles. I've been in the field and I've been in a variety of different roles. And I'm now an active association member and working with TAG Action.
And your interesting fact?
My interesting fact is that I once, except now there are people knowing it now, anyway, I made a career transition at one stage from working with the Just for Last Festival to Canadian Centre for Victims of Torture.
Okay. Interesting fact. Some people have escaped my grasp. Who hasn't? Yes.
Hi, my name is Neha. I've been invited here by Samara. We went to the same college. And I'm an immigration attorney, but I do U.S. immigration, so I'm interested in UK immigration.
And your interesting fact?
Too much pressure. I'm Hanan and Yusuf. I was also invited here by Samira. Thank you.
I think I'm interested in how you connect what you do in advocacy with what's coming from the field. And that the two-way relationship there. And what was an interesting fact? I'm taking a second master's at SOAS in migration.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Aileen. I'm a nurse. I've done a few missions in MSF. I was in task here for 6 months. I'm here because I want to get a bit more involved in the Take Action group and just learn a bit more. And an interesting fact, my first language is Irish, Gaelic.
Brilliant.
I didn't speak English till I was 5.
Wow, that is interesting.
Hi, my name is Catherine Tome, and I've just come back from my first mission in Greece, working as a Farsi interpreter. I'm generally interested, but I'm actually particularly interested in understanding more why it's so hard for Afghans to get refugee status in this country. Good luck with that. And my interesting fact is that I also speak Mandarin Chinese.
Brilliant. Okay, so my name's Anna. I'll introduce the organisation in a minute, but just my connection with MSF is very tenuous, and I have found myself in meetings with Costa and with Clea in the past. And I've also just spent, I'm just name dropping now, I've just spent 3 weeks with a guy called Ignacy Calvo, who some of you might know, who used to head up MSF operations in Mexico and in Afghanistan on a State Department funded trip around the States. But anyway, so I know a little bit more about MSF, having spent time with him. And my interesting fact is I have a very, very real phobia of buttons. A little random, but entirely true. And you will see I'm not wearing any buttons. And it's actually a lot more common than people realise. It's not that unusual. But I'll stop there. So I guess to start with, I wanted to introduce my organisation to you. I'm from the Refugee Council. We're very much a domestic organisation. Somebody talked about connection between advocacy and what's happening in the field. I can talk about what we see operationally in the UK, but we don't have operations outside the UK. So our advocacy, aside from the question of safe and regular routes, our advocacy is solely about the UK, what happens in the UK, and the situation facing refugees and asylum seekers here. We're primarily operation or service delivery organisation, and we aspire to help refugees and people seeking asylum kind of end to end from point of arrival through to decision and post-decision, including supporting newly recognised refugees and resettled refugees. We have kind of 4 service areas really. We actually have the government contract to provide advice and guidance to unaccompanied children. So and we have had that for many years. So that's a big area of expertise for us, and they're a big client group. We work in Hertfordshire and Yorkshire and Humberside with local authorities there to support resettled refugees. So we provide the integration support. So again, that's effectively central government money channeled through local authorities, enabling us to provide that support. And then we have sort of various projects and services for people in the asylum system. Much of those focus on therapeutic support. They are not as extensive as I would like them to be, and that's because since 2010, the sector, what I would call the sector, took a real beating, and we all had our funding massively slashed, and particularly services to adult asylum seekers suffered. And we also have some very specialist services supporting newly recognised refugees who've come through the asylum system, because this is a real area of, it actually is a moment of crisis, surprisingly, for many refugees when they're finally actually recognised. And we've developed some very specialist services to support them through that process. Again, not government funded, but that's something I'll touch on later on. And lastly, we do advocacy research policy work. We're a pretty small operation. There's 5 of us. I sit in that team. I'm one of 2 people who kind of basically does a kind of routine policy work for the organisation, which means that it's me and one other going to meeting after meeting with the Home Office. In terms of some of the expectations, there's a couple I'm going to struggle with, but I'm really happy to take questions and come back with answers, particularly to the lawyers in the room. I don't have a legal background, so probably won't be getting into lots of detail around that. And also, there are only 2 of us, and our focus is much more on the Home Office and the Department of Health. But I'm guessing there's actually a lot of knowledge in the room, so I think we can probably draw on that if there's questions around that. In terms of today's session, it's kind of as I say, it's entirely focused on the UK. It's basically a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the asylum process, mainly focused on the asylum process, although I will touch on resettlement. Although I'm going to start with a little bit with kind of definitions and some numbers to kind of get going. If I start to slip into kind of acronyms or jargon or anything that's unfamiliar, I'm kind of assuming some knowledge. So if I'm saying things that don't make sense to you, or as I say, slipping into jargon, then please stop me and ask questions as we go along.
We never have a problem with jargon in MSF.
Okay, I can't that. So I guess the starting point probably needs to be the 1951 Geneva Convention, which I imagine most of you are familiar with. It's the cornerstone of international refugee law. It defines who a refugee is and what are the legal obligations of states to protect them, to all those states that are signatory. And it's actually part of a set of guidelines and laws and conventions that came out during the 20th century. As you will realise, it was signed in 1951 in Geneva at a conference. At that time, there was geographical limitation. It was limited to really in response to refugees in Europe in the aftermath of World War II. But in 1967, it was amended with a protocol that expanded it to kind of global reach. There's 145 countries who are signatory, and as you would expect, the UK is one of them. And in fact, we were very involved. One of the lines we'd like to remind the Home Office is we were very involved in the drafting of the original convention, or certainly British lawyers were. So to meet the definition, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but just to pull out a few obvious things. Somebody needs to be outside their country of origin. So to be a refugee, you have to have crossed the border. You have to demonstrate a well-founded fear of persecution due to, on the basis of one of 5 grounds, which are race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a social group. You need to demonstrate that you're unable or unwilling, because of your fear, to seek protection from your own authorities. And the definition is forward-looking, so it's not enough to have experienced persecution in the past. You need to demonstrate you will experience it in the future if you are returned. So I wasn't going to do a massive thing on definitions, but I just wanted to check that people feel confident about when we talk about asylum seekers, what we mean, and understand that as a kind of legal term that is basically somebody applying for asylum underneath the convention. And obviously somebody who's been refused asylum is fairly self-evident. So there are 2 routes into the UK for refugees, 2 routes to refugee protection. I guess I wanted to quickly touch on resettlement, or we'll mainly be focusing on asylum for the rest of the session. What do people understand about what resettlement is? Any volunteers to give a bit of a definition of resettlement?
People from countries that were fleeing war who have an entitlement to being resettled somewhere in Europe.
Yeah.
Because of the status of the country.
Yeah, I mean, a key difference between resettlement and asylum is that you've been recognised as a refugee before you get to the UK. So that's one of the kind of key differences. So absolutely, yeah, you are recognised as a refugee, and you kind of alluded to the second point, which is to be entitled. Probably wouldn't use the term entitlement, but to be referred for resettlement, you need to meet criteria set out by UNHCR. And that basically means you have an additional need. So somebody is, or you are not safe in your first country of asylum. So you're a refugee, so you've already crossed a border, but for some reason you're still not safe, or you're not able to integrate. This usually means you have a medical need. I can't remember all of the UNHCR criteria, but it's like women and children at risk, you have a medical condition that can't be met. you were still at risk because perhaps whatever you were fleeing is perfectly able to cross a border and persecute you in your first country of asylum. So these are the what you would need to meet above and beyond being a refugee. Fundamentally, you need to be referred by UNHCR. So UNHCR will refers resettled refugees to a number of countries in the world. Though to be honest, there's only a few countries that resettle in high numbers. So the UK has resettlement schemes that you're hopefully aware of. We've actually been resettling since 2004 through the Gateway Protection Programme, not that commonly known. The numbers were very modest, and still are. It's still a scheme that exists. The Gateway Protection Programme resettles 750 refugees a year from all over the world. It's a great scheme. It works. They resettle primarily to Yorkshire and Humberside and Manchester, the two locations for Gateway. And in Yorkshire and Humberside, the Refugee Council works in partnership with local authorities there, and we have done since 2004. I'm sure you'll be aware of the emergence of these other resettlement schemes that developed basically in response to the refugee crisis when government came under pressure. And you've got the Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme, which is for people fleeing Syria, and the Vulnerable Children's Resettlement Scheme, which is always a mouthful to explain. It's basically a resettlement scheme that's primarily focusing on helping vulnerable children. They may be unaccompanied or they may be with their families. And there's a set quota of 3,000 by 2020 to be resettled from the MENA region. And the Syrian scheme is 20,000 by 2020, and that's people fleeing Syria. And just to sure there's no confusion, because there sometimes is, resettlement has nothing to do with dubs. If people are following what's around the dubs debate, it's nothing to do with Dublin. It's basically you can't get resettled from Calais. That's resettlement is not a solution for Calais. It's a solution for people. UNHCR would describe it as a durable solution for people who are mainly in countries hosting very high numbers of refugees, invariably some of the poorer countries in the world. The other route is...
Before you move on from resettlement, does resettlement mean, is the influence of that it's a permanent thing?
So
you're going on to talk about that later, then.
No, you're right. I was going to touch on it now, actually. So thank you for reminding me. If you are resettled, you'll be referred by UNHCR to the UK, and then you will get. You basically, it's a bit technical. You'll get indefinite leave to remain if you come through Gateway. So yes, but that's 750 people a year, and you'll get 5 years and refugee status if you come through one of the other routes. So it's about as permanent as we get when it comes to leave for refugees. You would also get 1 year's integration, 1 year plus of integration support. So that means in practice you will be met at the airport, you'll be taken. It will vary a bit depending on which local authority you're in, but this is what should be happening. You'll be taken to your house, which will be a place which will be your home for at least the next year. I can only really speak to how our services for resettled refugees, but we then provide intensive support. It's front-loaded. It's very much with the aim of getting people self-sufficient, standing on their own 2 feet as fast as possible. But yeah, some of my best days at work have been going up to Birmingham and supporting them on Arrivals Day when a group of refugees are arriving. They tend to come in groups of anything from 20 to 80 odd. And it's a very busy time for my colleagues, but also accompanying my colleagues as they take people to what's going to be their new home and listening to them try to manage what's quantity of information that they need to impart. And certainly, for Syrians it's a bit different, but some of the client groups, some of the people we've resettled to come and they need everything explained, from how the fridge works to how the kettle works, the importance of locking the door, and it's and then watching those families find their feet in the UK and create a new life for themselves. It's a lovely, they're lovely programs actually. I think they're work that we're really proud of. I think they're programs that the UK can be really proud of. The numbers are not as high as I'm sure some people would want them to be, but we resettle about 5,000 people a year now. which in the global context is not very many, but it actually still puts us as one of the countries resettling higher numbers. I think the only ones really, you've got Australia, Canada, and the US are the big resettlement countries. So that's resettlement. Everybody else, other refugees in the UK, and what we're going to kind of be focusing on primarily, have come through the asylum route. So they've arrived here and claimed asylum. So I wondered if, to start with, if people could give me an idea, a ballpark figure for how many people they thought claimed asylum in 2016.
Do you have to have landed here on the soil to claim asylum?
Everybody's jumping ahead of my presentation. Yes,
Sorry,
you do.
sorry.
No, it's a really good question. We're going to come to that.
It's
But
just
yes,
we have quite strict borders, don't we?
yeah,
Not like
but you're
Europe
right.
where
You have to claim asylum in the UK.
easily get there.
Yeah. So any guesses?
35,000.
Sorry?
35,000.
That is very good, very spot on, really. So yeah, there were 30,000 applications in 2016 and about 8,000 odd dependents. That's actually a drop from the previous year. I think it was a 6% drop, 7% drop. There's a briefing at the back with, of course, it's in the briefings.
I didn't
We have seen since sort of 2012, there's been a steady increase, but compared to what's happened globally and compared to what's happening in some European countries, really it's been fairly minimal in terms of the numbers increasing coming to the UK. And has previously, we've had much higher numbers if you go back to kind of early noughties. So the numbers have been very, very manageable in the UK. About a third of those applications are either by women or by unaccompanied children. So in addition to the dependents. So yeah, around 25% of all applications are made by women. And yes, in last year we saw just over 3,000 unaccompanied children claiming asylum. So I guess the key question is, why are the numbers so low given given the global situation? And you kind of hit the nail on the head when you said you have to be present in the UK in order to claim asylum. And this is an answer, this is a PQ response to a question about helping Syrians apply for asylum in the UK. And as you can see, the immigration minister, or then immigration minister, very clearly says that the UK is not in the practice of facilitating entry to the UK for the purposes of seeking asylum. So yes, this is not something that is on offer. However, what the immigration minister doesn't say in this response is that successive governments have made it increasingly difficult for people to get to the UK. And I'm not going to go into all the sort of different measures that have been put in place. And as I say, successive governments that have done this, and it's specifically with the purpose of preventing people claiming asylum. But there is a particular example I thought I'd highlight, which was in March 2015, which, as you remember, the refugee crisis was at its height. Done very discreetly, there was a change to the immigration rules which removed the exemption for Syrians, on transit to the US. And the reason they did that, and it was stated very explicitly, was that Syrians were arriving and claiming asylum. And it was done without the usual 21 days notice. And again, the explanation was for fear that people would abuse the system by arriving and claiming asylum. As I say, we were talking about Syrians, and this country's actually received, quite as you saw in the previous slide, we haven't seen high numbers of Syrians arriving except for the resettlement route. So I remember finding out about this change in the immigration, just being quite shocked at the language that they could talk about claiming asylum as an abuse. So yeah, fundamentally, this is why we don't see very many people claiming asylum. We're a very hard country to get to, and if there is a way in, and a country, for people fleeing a country or leaving a country where there's high numbers of refugees, invariably the government will crack down on it as soon as they can. So in terms of claiming asylum, the first question is, the first thing people have to do is basically apply for asylum. It's very important that people apply for asylum because once they've applied for asylum, they're protected from removal, at least until they've had a decision on their claim. The Home Office is very keen for people to apply for asylum at port. They put a big focus on this, and in fact, people are penalised if they don't apply for asylum as soon as possible. They'll be penalised. Potentially, it may be more difficult for them to get support, and it might count against them in terms of their asylum claim. It's always been the case that the vast majority of people will apply what we call in-country. My memory, I think it's around 90%, and it's remained constant, will apply in-country, and only around 10% are applying at port. And I wondered if people have thoughts about why that might be.
Is it like the fear of being like can't send back quite easily and quickly?
Fear, yeah. I think that's very likely to be a factor for some people. Any other ideas?
I guess from my background in freedom from torture, our clients have had horrendous experiences of the authorities in their home country.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
The lack of understanding of the system. Yeah, they don't realise that it's going to be most of their issues with fine.
Yeah.
Is it also because they've maybe got some contacts in the country and they want to just make their way to that contact? They have either a relative, neighbour, friend.
It may
and
well.
Maybe you just get some refuge before you have to go through that process of, I suppose, filling forms, etc.
I think, yeah, focusing on if they're trying to reach somebody. I think these are all reasons why somebody may not claim at port. And I think the one that we see most commonly is people don't realise that that's what they need to do. They don't even necessarily understand that claiming asylum is the process they need to take. Of course, they may come in a lorry. They might find themselves on a side of a motorway somewhere in a service station because they've come on a lorry with smugglers, and they weren't aware when they were passing through the port, and that also happens frequently. And they may have been been given misinformation by smugglers as well. So there's a variety of reasons why someone may not claim asylum at port, none of which the Home Office is particularly sympathetic to. If they haven't claimed asylum at port, they'll be required to go to Croydon. So it's in Croydon in Luna House where there is what's now called the asylum intake unit. So that's where people are required to go. There are it is possible to claim asylum in local Home Office enforcement offices. And actually that's unaccompanied children are exempt and they're allowed to kind of claim asylum locally. This is like a point of tension between the Home Office and stakeholder NGOs like Refugee Council, particularly the Scottish Refugee Council, because it actually causes, obviously people can be really quite a difficult, vulnerable situation when they first arrive. So if you have, Scottish Refugee Council will see someone who's arrived in Glasgow, and they have to tell them they've got to get themselves down to Croydon in order to apply for asylum. There's no money to help them do that, and what often happens is SRC ends up trumping up the money for an overnight bus. And the Home Office has been really kind of really strict and stringent about who they might consider suitable for who they might allow to be screened locally. So we have had scenarios of 8-9 month pregnant women getting overnight buses, having arrived on, after horrific journeys, and then being told they had to get on a overnight bus to get down to Croydon. And in fact, one did actually go into labour on the steps of Luna House. So it's a real one of the areas where there's been a lot of debate and discussion with the Home Office and little progress. So it's that screening. You'll have your first interview with the Home Office at screening. You'll have your screening interview, and they'll take a whole bunch of basic information from you: your name, how you got here, what documents you have with you. I don't think it's publicly available, the form that they use at that point, but they did share it with us a couple of years back, and I was a little bit astounded by the barrage of questions that people get, from including stuff like the address of your local police station and the address of your hospital, the schools that you went to. So when I say it's basic information, it's also extensive, and information that, as I pointed out in a meeting that I was in, I would not be able to volunteer, that I would not have readily available. Exactly the purpose of that remained somewhat unclear to me. Certainly we know that the information given at screening will be checked later on when they assess the asylum claim. But what certainly is true is it does make it a very overwhelming experience that probably feels quite hostile to people, and that is basically their first interaction with the Home Office. It's at that point you'll get people will be given their asylum registration card, and the ARC card that they'll have fingerprint taken and photo taken, and that's like quite an important document that basically acts as their ID for the remainder of their time. It's on that they'll need that for to access any financial support they're getting from the Home Office. It's also at that stage that the Home Office will do a check on Eurodac, which is European database, to see whether there's any evidence that the person applying has been in one of the other countries, European countries that's signatory to Dublin. So this is about checking that they basically have they passed through European country. If they have evidence they're going to hit, if they've applied for asylum in, say, let's say Italy, or they've or had their fingerprint taken, they will not. Their claim won't be considered, and they'll basically be subject to removal to back to Italy.
Just quickly explain Dublin.
Yes.
So people online can't hear people who ask questions. Would it be possible for you to repeat the question?
Oh, okay.
Because they can hear you fine, but they can't hear the question.
Right. I'll try. Remind me if I forget.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
So Dublin is, I think we're on our third version of Dublin. It is basically a system for signatory states to decide who is responsible for an asylum claim. There's quite a lot of misinformation about Dublin. So, it's very disadvantageous to those states that are on the border of Europe, because basically what it says is that you should claim asylum in your first country, and if you don't, then the country where you do claim asylum can send you back. So basically, the country responsible for assessing your asylum claim is the first country where you arrived in Europe. So obviously, it puts an enormous pressure on Greece and Italy. There's some positive elements of Dublin. So previously Dublin was only thought of as a bad thing, and I think, it's true. It is, it is pretty rubbish, and it's not a very effective way of organising at a European level how we manage asylum claims. But so it was previously thought of as wholly negative, and there was always a positive element to it, which is that if you have a family connection, certain family connections, in another European country, that European country would be responsible for your asylum claim. The definition of family is quite narrow for adults. It's largely your spouse or civil partner or children. But the definition for unaccompanied children is actually quite broad. So Dublin offers an opportunity, particularly for unaccompanied children travelling alone. So in theory, they can claim asylum in Italy, but say, but my uncle lives in the UK. And Italy can ask to transfer the child to the UK to have their asylum claim considered in the UK. In practice, there's huge problems, and the positive element doesn't work very well. A major part of that is because there's a lack of faith in the system. So people know that the message has got through that you've got to claim asylum in your first country of arrival, so they don't want to claim asylum in Italy, because they don't want any evidence that they've been in Italy, and they don't trust that they will be able to get transferred to the UK. But it's, like I said, primarily, now the sort of debate has moved on, and it's seen as a something positive thing, and actually it's got good and bad in it. And as I say, there are some significant difficulties with how it operates. Does that make sense?
Can I ask, so if someone comes to the UK, do they then have to lie about how they got here? So they have to say they haven't been through any European countries?
They may not have. I mean, some people may have arrived on false papers. Some people may have already been in the UK, on a student visa, and then circumstances in their home country changed. But if they travelled through a European country, they would be better off not mentioning that in their screening interview. So if they were open about that, they'll get sent back. Or certainly the Home Office would attempt to send them back to whichever country they came from. So yeah, I just wanted to very quickly give you a bit of insight into what it's like for somebody claiming asylum. I wanted to talk about a friend of mine who I'm calling Marie. She was from DRC. She had fled a horrific violence, particularly horrific sexual violence, both in her home country, and then she actually first of all went to Ivory Coast, and then in the Ivory Coast she suffered further persecution. She ended up in the UK. She didn't know what to do, and she actually, a Ghanaian family befriended her on the plane, and so she went to stay with them for a couple of months in Birmingham, and they persuaded her that she needed to go to Croydon, she needed to claim asylum, and they gave her the money to get to Croydon. She got to Croydon, and she was told, and I didn't mention it, you have to make an appointment now, so you have to phone to make an appointment, and so she left the building and tried to phone this number, and her remaining money disappeared into this phone box as she tried to connect to make her appointment for screening, and she failed that day. So she gave up, and she spent that night in the telephone box outside the screening unit, where she was found the next day. And finally, the system should not have worked like that. There should be the possibility of dropping appointments, and I hope that is functioning better now. Certainly, it seems to function better now than it did when she arrived. It was a few years back. So she finally got to see a screening officer who shouted at her and told her that she was going to get sent back. I imagine because it became apparent she'd been in the country for a couple of months. She got so distressed in the interview that she was actually sent to emergency accommodation and told to come back the next day. The whole thought of going back to the Home Office filled her with so much fear that she ended up disappearing and trying to find the family in Birmingham again and begging enough money to get herself back to Birmingham. She got back to Birmingham, she couldn't find the family. So she then spent a period of time on the streets. And ended up in quite a mess. And she talks about a man who spoke Swahili who eventually helped her and took her to hospital. By then she had quite a number of medical complications. And he was also the one who persuaded her she really did need to claim asylum. And so she came back to Croydon, and unfortunately saw the same screening officer who told her that she'd just made her situation worse, and she was probably going to get detained. I guess this was her first introduction to the asylum system and her first introduction to the Home Office. As I say, there was a particular problem at that time around when they introduced the system of phoning for appointments, which I think has been largely resolved. But even so, her first interaction with the screening officer was extremely negative, and I'm far from confident that will have changed. I've actually done some training with screening officers. I think that people have very inconsistent, very different experiences, and it's very much kind of luck of the draw of who you get. So once you've applied for asylum, you're then able to apply for asylum support.
There's a question here? Yeah. Sorry. Could I just ask, is there any entitlement to be accompanied by someone in this pre-screening interview? Can you say, I want someone from NGO or here with me?
Right. So the question is there entitlement to be accompanied in your screening interview? Not for adults, no. For children, I think there may have been in the past. There's actually recent changes for children, and they no longer have to go through screening. But for adults, I think there's a question of whether people have access to NGOs at that point. But no, and lawyers don't have access as far as I'm aware either. Yeah, obviously you'll have an interpreter if you need an interpreter. Was somebody going to ask? Were you going to ask? Okay. So after you've had your screening interview and you're officially in the asylum system, you're then able to apply for asylum support if you are destitute, if you're facing destitution. So you have to, this is a whole other process, and to be honest, you could easily do an hour-long presentation on asylum support. I wanted to mention it quickly because certainly from our experience is the failings in this system causes so much heartache to people in the asylum system. I kind of couldn't not mention it. asylum seekers are entitled to support under the Section 98 and 95 of the 99 Immigration and Asylum Act. What will happen is Section 98, you will go into what's called initial accommodation. That's 7 centres across the UK, one of 7 centres across the UK. And that's where you will go if you're immediately facing destitution. They're actually trying to restrict access to that a lot and put a lot of pressure on people to stay with any family or friend that they might have. But you should, if you're facing destitution imminently, in theory, you should go into initial accommodation while they consider your application for asylum support. If you've got your claim for asylum, you also have to make an application for asylum support. And that is also quite a lengthy, tedious form where they will ask a lot of questions about your ability or your lack of ability to support yourself. Initial accommodation tends to be full board hostels, 3 meals a day, no access to cash while you're in them because you get your 3 meals. So you're dependent on the food that's provided to you. It's usually dorm situations, so really problematic for freedom from torture clients and others with PTSD, having to share kind of a dorm situation. In theory, there isn't a target, but they say you can expect to have a decision on your asylum support application and to be allocated longer term accommodation within 19 days. In practice, it massively varies. So some people that will work and you'll be in there for a matter of days or weeks. Others get stuck there for months, and this will become their burning issue. The thing that's really difficult for them. I think some IAs are better equipped than others, but some of them are really not well equipped for people to live there for a long period of time. And invariably, the people who get stuck are the people who are least likely to be able to cope with the conditions of IA. So it'll be people with disabilities. And the reason, for example, and that is because they will be struggling to source appropriate longer-term accommodation for them. So they will end up stuck there for months. Pregnant women tend to spend a long time in IAs, particularly if they're late in their pregnancy, because of all the anxieties around sending them to a new part of the country where they may not get, may have problems getting back into maternity care. So one of the concerns that we raise frequently with the Home Office is that while the diet in IA, in initial accommodation, is probably fine for a few days or even a few weeks, it is not appropriate for a pregnant woman for months on end. So yeah, that's extremely stressful. In theory, as I say, you should get your decision and you should get allocated longer term accommodation, which is normally self-contained flats in a dispersal area. So just to flag, this is all done by the Home Office, who will look at your asylum support application, but it's private companies, it's Serco, G4S, Clear Springs, who run accommodation basically, so profit-making companies who are kind of running both the initial accommodation and the longer-term dispersal accommodation. You have no choice about where you go. This is also hugely problematic for people in the asylum system, that they will be sent wherever. There's pretty much, it's very, very hard to fight a dispersal decision. It's very hard to win a request to go to a specific place, whether you have family members. The only groups who manage to do it are actually mainly freedom from torture clients. Basically, you have to prove that you're accessing a specific treatment that you will not have access to if you move to a different area. So, but in the main, people are sent, and of course they're sent away from London and the southeast. What that means in practice is some people don't, some people say, right, I'm going to sofa surf in London. If being near their community or family, friends, whatever it may be, they'll forego this support. They will be able to apply for what's called support only or subs only, which is the money that they get. So if you end up in dispersal accommodation, you'll end up in a self-contained flat and your bills will get paid for, and then you'll get £5 a day, effectively. It's about £36 a week to live off. And people can have the option of applying for subs only if they want to kind of come to London. In practice, they will wait a very, very long time to get a decision on that application, and that's been very problematic for lots of our clients. I guess just to say, living circumstances is a source of enormous unhappiness for our clients, and it kind of always has been. Both standards, whether it's, I mean, you do hear some horrific reports of rat-infested housing, but also the fact that they're required to share. So whether it's sharing of dorms, initial accommodation, and even in longer term accommodation, the sharing situation can cause people a lot of stress, and be really a source of a lot of unhappiness for them. At some point, you'll have your substantive interview. That's your main interview. This sometimes can happen early in the process. You might actually still be in initial accommodation. This is like a critical part of the asylum process. So this is when you have to show that you're in need of protection and you cannot safely be returned to your country of origin. Hopefully, you'll have secured the advice of a lawyer before going into your interview, who will help prepare you for that interview. They will not be allowed to come with you. They'll not be allowed to come with you to the interview. Asylum is covered by legal aid, but it's not as simple as you find a solicitor and they get legal aid. They have to have a contract with the legal aid agency. So actually, access to legal representation is a problem, is a real issue. As part of that interview, they will check the information that you gave at screening. They'll kind of look for consistencies or inconsistencies. After the interview, you should get a decision within 6 months. There's no set time frame, but they have a kind of target of 6 months for what they call straightforward cases. I don't know if some of you, one or two of you, may have been aware of the Independent Chief Inspector and Board of Immigration report that's just come out, that's looking at actually the growing number of cases that they say are not straightforward. And if they decide that your case is not straightforward, there's no target. So then you might wait a very long time, and actually that may well be more complex cases, and again, the people least able to cope with the asylum system. The person who makes a decision on your claim won't necessarily be the person who's interviewed you. That was something the Home Office aspired to at one point and has gone by the wayside. And when they make this decision on the person's claim, on the asylum seeker's claim, again, under the Geneva Convention, they'll be looking to see whether the harmful treatment that somebody has experienced amounts to persecution, whether the person's fear of persecution is well-founded, whether it's for one of the 5 reasons under the Convention. This is a common one, whether or not they can find protection in their own country. So this comes up a lot, particularly with women, that they can relocate within their own country. They don't need protection in the UK. And again, it's future-facing, whether there's a risk of them experiencing persecution if they are returned. If someone is found, if the decision maker decides they don't meet the definition of a refugee under the Geneva Convention, they will then consider whether or not they need protection under Article 3 of the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, which is basically whether or not they would be at serious harm if they were returned to their home country. So that's kind of a second stage. If somebody's refused, they have the right to appeal to the first tier tribunal and have their case seen by an independent immigration judge. There will be a title to legal aid again, but it's challenging to get. There's for their first for the first claim, for their first stage, it's only means tested, so you'll get legal aid if you can prove that you don't have the means. At this stage, it is both means and merits tested, so you not only need to show that financially you're not able to pay, but on top of that, that you've got more than a 50% chance of winning your case. So it can be really quite a struggle for people to get legal support at this stage. There's quite a high, that said, there's quite... Sorry.
Does the person get the ability to temporarily work while the process is ongoing?
So questions whether people are allowed to work. That's a really good point. I should have flagged earlier on that no, you're not allowed to work. So the reason why there's this whole asylum support system about applying, going to one of these full-board hostels, is because you're not allowed to work and you don't have access to mainstream benefits. This is very much, you're kept separate. Sorry, I mean, to be strictly speaking, if you've waited more than a year for your asylum claim, you are then allowed to apply for permission to work. However, if you get permission to work, you will be limited to the shortage occupation, I can't remember what it's called. So it's sort of, I mean, it's very, very specialist jobs. So in reality, the reality is people seeking asylum don't work. So this is obviously particularly relevant if you end up in that second category of people whose claim is considered not straightforward and you wait a long time, because you could be stuck in limbo for a very long time, living in, as we've talked about, pretty difficult circumstances.
What would happen if, for example, they started doing a small business like washing cars or something like that? Would that go badly?
You wouldn't be able to do that legally. So you would be working illegally. So you'd be at risk of, and you'd be jeopardising your case. Yeah.
Am I right in saying that the appeal to the first tier tribunal, that's where, if you have the resources, you would engage solicitors and pay an expert witness to plead your case?
Yeah.
Expert witnesses basically monitor the country, and they can say that if you get sent home, you're going to be tortured and killed, or something terrible to happen.
Yeah.
Now, obviously the main problem with this is that the only people who can do that are people who have money.
Yeah.
Now, is there any organisation, setting aside legal aid, which you say is sporadic and difficult to access, is there any organisation that funds that process here? Is there any NGO, any charity that has money for that?
So the question is whether there's NGOs funding expert reports for the appeals process.
Yeah.
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, what does tend to happen is organisations like Freedom from Torture are at that point able to submit expert reports and medical legal reports, and that they can carry, I think, a degree. I'm looking at you. You work for Freedom from Torture.
Yeah, but I mean, these expert witness reports cost money, don't they? Where does the money come from?
Do you want to most of the time people should be able to apply for legal aid if they're accepted for their report, if they've been accepted because they have some evidence that has been tortured. So theoretically there is legal aid for that, but everything extends to the process.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there's an alternative source of funding if the legal aid isn't available.
Yeah, like I say, I think what you do tend to see happen is organisations like Freedom from Torture will then get an opportunity to submit reports, so that can have quite an impact on the result of a case. But I'm not aware of like other funding for other experts aside from that. Did you have?
It's a question that piggybacks on yours, not just strictly regarding the legal support these people need, but that are NGOs or civil society allowed to interact in any way, in any stage of the process up till now, as you've described? In other words, where does your work, Refugee Council and other NGOs like you start? Once they have asylum?
No. There's a range of NGOs who support people through the process in different ways. There's limitations on how they can support them. I think with the legal process, then they're really it's very limited. I mean, what often people get asked is to provide letters of support. So we would often, but that's, I mean, I've always been a bit sceptical of whether that really makes any difference to somebody decide the decision on their claim that they've had a letter from an NGO saying that they're a good person. But support will vary in a range of ways. A lot of it's around, certainly my organisation, a lot of the support is around the asylum support system. So it's the kind of thing that my organisation and other organisations would be advocating to get people into the asylum support system and fighting destitution. So that's a lot of the focus will be on. There's a lot of focus on therapeutic support. We've got very specialist organisations like Freedom from Torture, Helen Bamber Foundation, that are about supporting people with their therapeutic needs, and that can have implications for their asylum claim. And my organisation does a bit of that it's a more short-term model. So it's quite a big question because there's different ways that different organisations help at different points in the process. I haven't been able to get into lots of detail, but the challenges you might have, you might get your asylum support application refused and find yourself destitute, and there's a specific organisation that will represent you at the Asylum Support Tribunal. That will represent you at the asylum. So that's again lawyers. So it sort of depends where you're at. But with the legal process, there is limited. It is limited. I'm conscious of time. I guess just to quickly move forward, I just want to comment that most people who get a positive decision on their claim are like to get refugee status at the moment. That can fluctuate depending on where people are coming from. But for a while now, we've seen the vast majority of people who get a positive decision getting refugee status. A very small minority, a tiny proportion, will get humanitarian protection. Humanitarian protection. If you get granted leave under the on the basis of Article 3 of the European ECHR, you'll get humanitarian protection. These are actually very similar. You get 5 years leave, limited leave. The only difference, and you will get, access to welfare. You're allowed to work. For both of them, you will be given the right to reunite with your family, unless you're a child. Children are denied the right. Child refugees are denied the right to bring their family to the UK. The only difference is really around in your travel documents. So if you get refugee status, you'll get a convention passport, whereas under humanitarian protection, you'll get a travel certificate, which is more limited and more expensive, and there's a few disadvantages. And the major thing really is access to education. So if you get humanitarian protection, you will not be exempt. You will have to be here ordinarily resident for 3 years before you can qualify as a home student. So that's a significant difference, actually, a significant barrier. But as I say, only a minority of people at the moment are getting humanitarian protection.
So you say 5 years limited leave. What happens after that?
So after 5 years, you can apply for indefinite leave to remain, and after a year of that, you can apply for citizenship. That's where a lot of the debate is at the moment with the Home Office. They are the recent developments. It's more narrative coming out from government than actual concrete policy changes, but there's talk of reviewing. At the moment, the way it works in practice is you will apply for ILR, and unless you have been back to your country of origin or committed a crime, you will most likely get ILR. Previously you would get indefinite leave to remain if you were found to be a refugee, and that was changed maybe about 10 years ago. And we were very fearful about the implications of that, and we were worried that meant at 5 years we would start to see people being returned or being refused further leave, and that our fears weren't realised actually, and that isn't what happened, and the vast majority of people got ILR. It's unclear exactly. I mean, it sounds like at the moment the Home Office is trying to work out how to implement what the sort of rhetoric that's coming out of government, but there is talk about that's a risk. There's definitely a risk. There are a lot of difficulties for the Home Office in terms of capacity to then start reviewing asylum claims, all asylum claims at 5 years, to see whether there's still risk. But they do talk about that, and even doing reviews during the 5 years. So it's an area of kind of, so it's like something we're watching. If you're refused, obviously you get no leave, and you will be expected to return to your country of origin unless you're an unaccompanied child. So children generally are not returned. They will get something called UASC leave, which will be up to 30 months, which will basically take them up to 17 and a half. And at that point, they will need to apply for further leave, and they will then start to face a real prospect of removal. There used to be well, there used to be more provision for the possibility of voluntary return. So you used to get an advice service, possibility of a grant for reintegration in your home country, as well as your flight paid. All that's been scrapped, and you now only get your flight paid. So there's no advice service. There's only very limited circumstances when somebody will get reintegration support.
I heard some countries are sending them back by boat. Do we always send them back by flight here in the UK?
So is it possible to repeat?
Yes, so the question is, do we always send them back by plane? Do they sometimes get sent back by boat? I have to say, I am not aware of anyone being returned by boat.
From any European country?
It may, I couldn't speak to that. I'm not aware in the UK of that happening.
I'm sorry, just seeking clarification. So they pay for your plane ticket if they refuse your asylum claim?
They will pay for your plane ticket back to your home country. But not now if you're in detention. So this has been a recent change. If you're in detention, you will be forcibly removed or possibly released, which is up to when they realise they can't remove you. But yes, you can't voluntarily leave now from detention. But previously there was a bit of a kind of a package which included an advice service so people could consider their options. The alternative is, of course, what a lot of people face is destitution, so they're not allowed to work. They have no means of regulating their status.
Sorry, when the 5 years is up, are you saying that most of the time it goes automatically to indefinitely, or are there? Is the sort of the tide changing? And if so, how, if somebody was to be refused, do they take into account sort of medical legal reports? Or is it, once they've said no, they mean that that's it?
So there's a question around. So there's a question around.
What I was asking is, once the 5 years is up, there is an application actually in.
Yeah.
Is the likelihood? I mean, how rigorous is it that is it a rubber stamp to indefinite leave, or are they?
So the question is the extent to which they assess applications for indefinite leave to remain when your 5 years is up. And at the moment, our understanding has been it's basically a rubber stamping exercise. Right. So the things they're checking is, have you returned to your home country? Because if you have, it means you're no longer fearful of no longer fear persecution, and have you committed a crime? Currently, I mean, the extent to which this is set on policy, I wouldn't want to cite, but that's the sort of practice. It's very much a rubber stamping exercise. Of course, there's a capacity question for the Home Office about seriously assessing ILR applications. So expert reports and what have you don't come into it at the moment. Okay. There's a concern, a little bit of a concern going forward. I should say, if you've been refused, you will have the possibility of putting in a fresh claim. So that's what happens with some people, is that they're refused, but if they can prove that they have additional evidence that hasn't been considered, they can put in a fresh claim for asylum. In theory, it takes them back to the beginning of the process. In practice, they are disadvantaged having it put in although some people, I know people who go on to get protection after putting in a fresh claim, you are disadvantaged in different ways by the Home Office, who frown on that, and they believe that people just put in fresh claims after fresh claim to stop removal and to stay on support.
Just a quick clarification. Once you get ILR, you're allowed to ask for citizenship, are you?
After a year.
After a year.
You can apply for citizenship after having been a year after getting ILR.
We've got about 10 minutes.
Okay.
Before probably some people will need to go.
Okay, so this is basically the difference between positive and negative. I guess one thing I wanted to flag, even if you get a positive decision, you get no integration support whatsoever, which contrasts really interestingly with those coming through the resettlement route. So there's no government funded support, and you'll have to leave your asylum accommodation within 28 days of getting your biometric residency permit, your first set of documentation. A negative decision, adults without children have got 21 days to get out of their accommodation. If you have children, it doesn't apply and you can stay in your accommodation. you must report you will have been reporting, going off to Home Office enforcement units, probably throughout your time in the asylum system. But this becomes a really traumatic event for lots of people once they've been refused asylum, with reason, because this is when they're more likely to get picked up and detained and face removal after reporting than a dorm rate. So there's every reason for them to be fearful. You're, of course, subject to detention and return, and then we talked about voluntary return. So this is just about different I mean, we can discuss this. This is the different themes that people are campaigning on at the moment. It's not exhaustive list at all. Lots of stuff happening about safe, regular routes, particularly some of the INGOs are focusing on, and that's with a focus on family reunion, resettlement. There's big campaigns on detention, which I know MSF have got involved in. The asks on detention, and I didn't talk too much about that, but you can get detained at any point in the asylum process, and lots of people are detained. The big asks around detention, the main one is for a 28-day time limit, because the UK is the only country in Europe that doesn't have a time limit on detention. So there's a big push for 28-day time limit, and there's quite a focus on women and getting pregnant women out of detention, and now it's sort of moved on. So have some success around that, and that's moved on to about women who've experienced sexual violence not being detained. Lots of the organisations are trying to address the question of destitution. I mean, this just comes up time and again throughout, from the beginning of the process right through to even if you get a positive decision on your asylum claim, you face destitution at that point. If you've been refused, you're definitely going to find yourself, you're most likely to find yourself destitute at some point. So there's campaigning around that, but a lot of that is actually really just trying to respond to people's immediate needs. And then there's lots of sort of constant work that goes on that's basically just about defending the status quo. And I think that's probably some of the sort of stuff around health access probably comes a little bit under that banner, the likes of what Doctors of the World have been doing a lot of around charging. It's not an area that I'm that knowledgeable on, but that's a big problem. What I would say for people in asylum, for most people in the asylum system, the problem around that comes because of the amount of confusion around who is entitled and who isn't entitled. And so consequently, people who are actually entitled to free NHS get refused wrongly because people aren't aware of it.
Anna, can I just jump in on that point? So this, as for those of you who are interested as part of the TAG Action Group at MSF, we are going to be working with Doctors of the World to train people to teach healthcare workers about this issue, about what are refugees and migrants entitled to in terms of healthcare, and what can healthcare workers do to try and improve these barriers. So look out for your emails to see what we can do about that in the new year. Sorry to jump in there.
No, I mean, maybe I should stop there anyway, because I've talked quite a lot. I mean, it's just, there's nothing here that's, as I say, it's not an extensive list. To give you some idea of some of the organisations that you might, I mean, I was imagining people from different parts of the country, and City of Sanctuary would directly produce a fabulous network that's really exploded in recent years.
There are some people that are online.
Okay.
They'll be sending this out, and it's one of the things I think that our group has been trying to do. We tend to end up very London-centric because it's easy to have meetings here. But we would like to provide more opportunities for people all around the country.
So City of Sanctuary is a bit of a gateway into finding out how you can get involved and support refugees, people seeking asylum in your local communities, whether that's through volunteering or getting involved in campaigning. They're very, very grassroots, so each group operates quite independently, but it's a good way of kind of linking up to your local scene. And the other thing, I mean, just to flag in terms of the destitution question, I would just put it out there that a key way that we keep our clients off the streets is people who are volunteering, offering up their spare rooms. And that's, which is a massive, massive ask of people, but their hosting networks are growing and are becoming more important. They do offer a bit of a lifeline across the country. If you want generally to stay up to date with developments in this world, we've just started an advocacy network. Which I put the web link up there, so you can sign up online to that.
Some of the stuff, MSF has close connections with the Red Cross traditionally, and I see you've got the British Red Cross up there. What do they do?
So the Red Cross, I mean, I put that partly because, you know, with the sort of the amount of attention on refugee issues that have come in the last few years, as somebody who worked in this area for many years, it was a bit strange for me because suddenly I was working on this kind of quite niche issue, and suddenly it was a headline news item, and there was this overwhelming public support, which was amazing. The problem is it's a bit of a beaten up sector which doesn't have the resources to take advantage of the public support available, and that's certainly true of the Refugee Council, that we really kind of struggled to do that. I felt like I should put it up there because we do have some volunteering opportunities, but we have very limited because we don't have the structure available. One of the things that has happened over the years, I am going to your question, is you've seen a diminishing sector, and you've seen diminishing support from government for people in the asylum system, and the primary organisation that stepped into that gap is the Red Cross. So the Red Cross is, because they have the infrastructure to do it, are probably the first organisation addressing the question of destitution of asylum seekers. They're particularly, I mean, I say they're particular areas of addressing the question of destitution in very, very practical ways, so running drop-ins, hot meals, that kind of thing. And obviously family reunion. The Red Cross help with family reunion applications for help with that process. And I know that they have plans to campaign on detention. But the real kind of like helping somebody get through the process, the Red Cross probably offer more just because of their reach.
Yeah, so, I mean, the advantage that the Red Cross used to work for the British Red Cross. So they do have that kind of reach across the country. They also have quite a big anti-trafficking program, so it's supporting victims of trafficking when they locate them, helping them get through the national referral mechanism, helping them navigate the system as well. So that's a relatively new program.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's been scaling up, and it's actually a really nice program, and they've been doing that in conjunction with the Croatian Red Cross, and they're expanding it across the Red Cross network as well.
I mean, I'm probably not particularly doing justice to what the Red Cross does. I guess my point of putting it here is that if you're in, I don't know, Stoke-on-Trent, and you want to volunteer with you want to help people seeking asylum and refugees, it's probably the Red Cross who might offer a service there, which is my purpose of putting it on.
Just in terms of mapping, you know, across all of the services, if we went on the Refugee Council website, is there who's done the mapping to say exactly who's doing what, where, and when? Is there?
I would love that to exist.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So this is a question of mapping of relevant services across the country. I mean, that really would be amazing if something like that existed. I'm not aware of it. Yeah, it's. I mean, I guess I would probably look at the Red Cross website actually in terms of that's going to detail at least where you've got Red Cross services. And then I'm not quite sure where to direct you. I mean, you've got in lots of these towns, you will have local organisations as well that have sprung up that I can't cover.
And for London?
For London, there isn't a central place where you'll see everything listed. The Refugee Council operates in London, so we deliver quite a few services in London. So quite a few of the organisations would have services here, but you're right, that would be a really useful resource. I mean, one thing that people seeking asylum get is they get the point of claim leaflet, which is in fact a 20-page document, which is not more than 20 pages, it's many, many pages. It's basically a book, and includes lots of information, but it also has a few links to a few of the main organisations, but nothing like what you're talking about.
But in practice, what often happens is that people, once they're referred to one service in one area, asylum seekers will get referred on, because everybody that works in that area knows everybody else that works in that area.
Yes, that's true. And of course, City of Sanctuary, again, that would have a role there. So City of Sanctuary, the local City of Sanctuary will be very plugged into what are the different services that are available to refugees and asylum seekers in that locality.
I mean, the reason I'm asking is, you know, when we've got working in the NHS, when everybody's under massive pressure and somebody asks a question, it would be very useful to say to, you know, in the community mental health teams or across the trust, okay, just plug into this is the website, go to blah blah blah, and then you will see what it is that's actually available for care coordinators, which are possibly, providing psychosocial support, not just the mental health support. Is that something that MSF might consider doing?
I'm writing it down. I mean, I think it's worth us discussing. I'm not sure if it's something that we can necessarily do, but we can get Rob on it.
Well, I think that have been attempts to put this sort of thing together in the past, not by MSF, by other organisations. And I think it kind of comes crashing down because of the lack of funding, because they need somebody to actually spend time putting that information together. And as we talked about earlier, I mean, there was a huge funding loss to a lot of asylum and refugee and immigrant organisations a few years back, which just completely sort of decimated the services, well, more than decimated, the services that are available, and actually then getting somebody to sort of centralise all that information. I think it was a bit more centralised. There were more organisations involved, so more people knew where to go. It's less available now, seemingly, because so many NGOs have actually ceased to exist now. It was really dramatic.
Yeah.
The number that closed. It was quite shocking.
Yeah, I know, but I mean, it almost needs something which is kind of fluid. That there's somebody that focuses on it. Just for a very short, because the funding comes in and out.
Yeah.
For instance, for South London, the Brush, Lewisham, Southwark, Lambeth. There is. I'm not quite sure how concrete it is at the moment, but with the trusts and the reconfiguration, there is also a lot of talk about working in partnerships, with the voluntary sector, and therefore the question then is also a little bit about funding as well. So I think there is a sort of fluidity that goes on, but if it was well documented, it would be an invaluable document.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the other thing is there are something called regional refugee forums, which operate to varying degrees of success in different areas, and they would potentially be, that would be that often include health practitioners, as well as, and that's like a kind of link, offers that opportunity to facilitate referrals and what have you, but that's not across the board, and I think operates better in some areas than others. But yeah, it would be amazing. I mean, Refugee Council used to run many years ago an information service. Quite whether it met that need, I don't know. But that was one of the first things that got cut when we lost 70% of our funding overnight. So yeah, but I agree, it would be a really valuable resource.
Sorry?
Was there a question from there?
Yes.
It's a facetious question.
Someone asked if they can hear more about the button phobia.
Sorry. The what? The button phobia. I'm happy to talk about that.
But there was another question earlier, actually. Sorry. Someone asked if can people work while claiming asylums, and you said not legally. So the question was, well, do people actually do so anyway? Is it common for people to do so anyway?
I don't know. If they do, it's a very hidden. I mean, I think the reality is people are put in very difficult circumstances and will engage in survival strategies, some of which will be not very safe. It's very risky for them to work. But I couldn't speak to the question of what proportion are engaging in kind of the informal economy.
You said 30,000 applications for asylum in 2016. How many of those were successful?
Oh, sorry, I meant to mention that. At the moment, I mean, this remained broadly fairly consistent over the years. Around about a third are accepted at first decision. So the Home Office tend to have a kind of grant rate of around a third at first decision. Of appeals, around 25 to 35% tend to be allowed of those that go on to appeal. Sorry? I don't know how many appeal. Sorry. That was the question. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think my assumption is that most people will appeal. Yeah. So that's quite high. It's quite high overturn rate. And what tends to happen is with certain groups, it will be much higher, particularly when the Home Office are engaging. they've tried to. There was some pretty dodgy practices going on around Eritrean refugees with an effort to try and discourage Eritreans coming here with referring to a very discredited Danish report in the kind of the country guidance that Home Office decision makers will refer to when deciding on a case. So we saw Eritreans who previously were granted refugee status, around 90%, 90+% of Eritreans applying for asylum would be granted refugee status. I don't remember what it dropped to, but it plummeted when they changed this country guidance based on this Danish report. And consequently, you saw this massive spike in Eritreans getting their appeals overturned by the immigration courts. So so for certain groups, there's some quite interesting patterns that go on, but the kind of general trend is around 25%.
Any idea what Afghans are so difficult for Afghans?
I was when you said Afghans, I was like, oh, what do I know about Afghans? I don't know. I think they struggle to get asylum, is my understanding, and I don't know what they're. I can have a look. If you give me your email address, I can. That's very readily available from the Home Office stats, so I can email you what the kind of overturn rate is. I know that a lot of our young clients, our unaccompanied children, are from Afghanistan, and they really struggle to get their protection needs recognised.
No, because I've been helping Iranians and Afghans.
Right.
Iranians get asylum within 6 months. Afghans, it can go on for years, if ever.
I think my understanding is that part of the reason is much like Germany said, we're putting all this effort as a government into stabilising Afghanistan, and so it should be safe for you to stay there.
But it's not.
But I imagine if they're refused on the basis that they can relocate internally in Afghanistan, I imagine that would be a reason for
But I think that was the German argument at one stage. A lot of Afghans certainly well be with the
Europe considers Afghanistan to be a safe country, which is astounding.
Yeah, agree.
Just came back to the question about the list, the mapping the services. Wouldn't it be possible just to do that in a kind of crowdsourced way? Like you just start some Wikipedia pages and people can upload and contact the influencers, and they contact their sub-network, and they just keep that list going, and they also keep that list updated as they go along. And it just sort of takes care of itself. Because having somebody sit and try to be part of all the networks is it's quite blind and resource intensive. But if you did the crowdsource sort of more open source way, maybe it could just happen on its own, and then you can say, okay, go to the Wikipedia page for Glasgow. And then you would find Glasgow, British Red Cross.
So I love that idea. This is crowdsourcing for mapping of services. I love that idea. I might take that away.
I tried to set this up a couple of years ago in Teesside when I was living there. I spoke to about 30 or 40 different NGOs to build an app where I got loads of different charities on so people could get involved, make donations, see what everyone's doing. And they didn't want to be involved because they didn't want to share their donors with other people, and they didn't trust me with their information or basically their reputation.
The only other argument that I could see against that is that if you have, and there was actually something that was done that was similar to that when people were moving rapidly through Europe, where there was sort of this, people could load information onto a website saying where you could get assistance along the migrant route from Greece up to Germany. The information changes more quickly, and then it doesn't get updated because people are very happy to put information up there, but they don't take it down when it's no longer relevant. And the other risk is if you have people that are hostile to refugees and migrants, you can potentially have resources up there that direct people to a very vulnerable people to a very unsafe place, and that's.
Yeah. So Costa wanted to say something.
I want to say that we tried to do that 1 year ago. So we invited around 100 grassroots groups here in the south, and we had a meeting here, all of us. It was around 100 groups, like some people were represented by Skype, somebody they just sent letters, and most of them were here. And it's in reality it's not so, for the reasons exactly Leah explained, it's not so easy because civil society is there are big NGOs, there are medium-sized NGOs, and you have a huge number of grassroots organizations who are just individuals, small groups that they do that on a voluntary basis. So there's a lot of they can work for 3 months, and they drop the project, and they go on, and this needs constant update, and that's very difficult. And also you have to share sensitive information at some point, and in practice, in theory it's a good idea, but in practice it's difficult. I guess NGOs like the Refugee Council, MSF, maybe they can do it more easily because we have some with relatively more.
Yeah,
but again, reality is always runs faster than you, and there's always more impediments than there's assistance.
There is a non-official source of information that I use. It's a few Facebook groups. There's a number of volunteer networks that share information because they work across Europe, including the UK. And there's a couple that I use in the UK. One's called UK Refugee Welcome, People to People Solidarity. The other one's called Refugee Aid Network. And people just post questions. And there's always somebody who knows somebody in a city who knows an NGO that will provide free bikes or football practice or English lessons. There's a wealth of knowledge. It's nothing official, so it's not guaranteed good information, but it's very useful.
But again, there's a big difference between telling people where they can find information for themselves as a refugee and referring somebody based on something. Yeah, I think maybe we'll just take 1 or 2 more comments and then we'll wrap up. We're running a little bit over, but you've been waiting.
Thank you. I have 2 questions, if we have time. One is about, again, when you are in initial accommodation or in self-contained flats or you have arrived at that flat, how many drop out? How many disappear? If you have stats on that. And then are there NGOs that look to find them or to catch them where other safety nets don't?
I don't think there's stats available on the numbers who drop out. I mean, the accommodation providers, G4S and the like, will have the stats on that. People will normally, they have an asylum claim in the system, so they will need to kind of keep the Home Office up to date with some, with a way of reaching them. So they would rarely, I don't think they would disappear completely. And would often pop up in often in the southeast or in London, and accessing services there. So I don't think I can answer. I don't think it's possible to answer your question.
Implied there then is that once you've put in your application, the chance that you will go illegal is smaller. Is that right?
Sorry.
Once someone who has already arrived here puts in their application is fingerprinted basically, the chances that they will disappear into this illegal space are diminished. I ask because I recently heard about basically a description of how it's working in Italy, which is a different framework. But people who are sent to these kinds of accommodation centers, they can't work. They are also poorly accommodated, poorly fed. They get €5 a day, £5 a day, but they are also in extremely isolated parts of the country where you have to walk an hour and a half to get to a night shop to buy, more poor food. So poor in nutritional quality. So some of these people just walk out the door one day and don't come back.
Okay, so the question is a bit of a comparison with the situation in Italy and the UK, and particularly whether people disappear from the system in the UK because of kind of poor accommodation. I think it's quite different to Italy. I think that people they definitely leave their accommodation, but I don't think they're likely. People are most likely to go illegal, like underground, when they've had their asylum claim refused. So when they lose hope. That's when the point that they're likely to disappear. They may disappear from your asylum support system, but they'll still be hoping for a positive decision on their claim. So I'm not saying that people don't kind of get lost, but I don't think it's a common, because most people are normally trying to sort out to get their protection needs recognised. They're trying to get status.
And then the other question, and I don't know anything about it except that it was in the news recently, I presume through the Vulnerable Children's Program, first unaccompanied boy from Syria was given asylum in the UK. And I think that application was at least a few years old. So why does it take so long? Like or does it take that long?
So resettlement is a totally different system.
Yeah.
So if the person applied for, if the boy got asylum, so applied for asylum and waited a long time, then he will have he arrived independently and claimed asylum, and he was definitely not resettled here. Why did it take so long? I think the Home Office have these two categories: straightforward cases and not straightforward. And if you end up in what's basically for more complex cases, there's far less attention on how they don't have to report on how long those cases are taking. So the target is 6 months for straightforward cases. So I think it's an example of when targets are actually creating a bit of a skewed and unhelpful situation, because all of the focus is being able to prove they're meeting a 6-month target for straightforward cases. So it could be that that he ended up in a not so straightforward.
Are there any more questions?
No.
Maybe we'll leave it there then. I just want to say thank you very much, Anna. It was really and for the rest of you lot, if you want to throw in your lot with us, you can find out information on the association page or go through and find out how to reach us. And we are sending out regular updates to the association about different actions. I'm sure you have seen us sending email after email recently. So thank you all for coming out this evening and for staying engaged.
Thank you for all the
Thank you.
Polish off the snacks and drinks.
Just say, and thank you for
Hopefully it went well, and maybe it was a few lessons we can learn for next time.
It was only around 8 o'clock that we started to drop it.
Well, 45 to 17, the way they've described it is that democracy, because I've done quite a lot of work with women actually, is that they don't see it, they're not too worried about the thing is, particularly because it's like a fruit bed, and so maybe just over a period of time, like about 6 months, like I say, the talks on the food